The federal courtroom was packed beyond capacity as Judge Merrick Garland took his seat behind the bench, his black robes flowing as cameras rolled for the historic live broadcast. The tension in the room was electric. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary hearing. American actor Jonathan Roumie sat at the witness table, his dark suit crisp, hands folded calmly as whispers filled the gallery. Just moments before the hearing began, word had leaked that Judge Garland was planning to issue a direct warning to Roumie about his recent widely publicized statements regarding the integrity and foundational principles of the judiciary. The media frenzy was instant, phones buzzing, reporters frantically typing, knowing they were about to witness something unprecedented. What happened next shocked everyone in that courtroom, witnesses would later say. Judge Garland didn't hold back, but Jonathan's response was something nobody saw coming. The cameras captured every second as Judge Garland leaned forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. But what Mr. Roumie did next would break the internet within minutes and change how America views public confrontations forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of these explosive public discourse moments that are reshaping our nation. Now, let's see exactly what went down in that courtroom. The stage was set for a battle between a towering figure of American jurisprudence and a prominent public voice, one representing the authority of the law, the other embodying a significant segment of public sentiment. Neither man was backing down, and the entire country was watching. Judge Garland had arrived at the courthouse that morning with a thick folder of printed materials and a stern expression that court staff recognized all too well. He had clearly spent hours preparing for this moment, reviewing every statement Roumie had made about the moral and constitutional underpinnings of the federal judiciary over the past several weeks. Legal clerks whispered that they had never seen the judge so focused on a single issue, so determined to make a point. Meanwhile, Jonathan Roumie had entered through the courthouse's main entrance, surrounded by a small group of supporters and concerned citizens who had come to show their support. Despite the crowd of reporters shouting questions, Roumie maintained his composure, offering only a brief statement. "I'm here to engage in a respectful dialogue about the profound issues facing our judicial system and its relationship with the public trust." The courtroom itself was a study in contrasts. On one side sat defenders of judicial institutions and legal order, many of whom had been calling for someone in authority to address what they saw as dangerous attacks on judicial independence. On the other side, concerned citizens, constitutional scholars, and proponents of public accountability filled the benches, ready to support their advocate in what they viewed as a fight for moral clarity and public trust. Security was unusually tight with additional federal marshals positioned throughout the courtroom. The unprecedented nature of this confrontation, a revered former judge and current attorney general directly challenging a prominent public figure in open court, had created concerns about potential disruptions. The gallery was filled to capacity with an overflow room set up to handle the additional spectators and media personnel. As Judge Garland called the hearing to order, with 3 sharp raps of his gavel, the room fell into complete silence. Even the court reporter seemed to hold her breath as the judge's eyes swept across the packed courtroom before settling on Mr. Roumie. The moment everyone had been waiting for was finally about to begin. Judge Merrick Garland, the current Attorney General and a former Chief Judge of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, was a figure of immense gravitas in American law. Known for his meticulous legal reasoning and unwavering commitment to the rule of law, Garland had served on the federal bench for nearly 2 decades before his appointment as AG. At 71, his career was marked by a deep respect for institutions and a stern belief in judicial independence. His track record was clear. He was an intellectual powerhouse, renowned for his fairness and his insistence on adherence to legal precedent. He didn't play favorites, didn't bend to political pressure, and had zero tolerance for anyone who undermined the authority or perceived impartiality of the federal court system. He had presided over some of the most complex and sensitive cases, earning him the reputation of being a judge's judge. His sharp questioning, ability to cut through rhetoric, and fierce protection of the judiciary's role as a non-political arbiter were legendary. Legal experts called him judicious and principled. His chambers, and later his AG's office, were lined with law books and constitutional treatises. But what stood out most was a framed copy of the Constitution prominently displayed. Colleagues knew that Garland viewed himself as a guardian of constitutional principles, particularly the separation of powers that kept the judicial branch independent from political interference. Over the years, he had faced criticism from various quarters for his steadfastness, but he had never wavered in his belief that the law must be applied impartially. Recent widely publicized statements by public figures, particularly those touching on the judiciary's integrity, had clearly struck a nerve with the former judge. Those who knew him well could see the deep concern in his eyes as he prepared to address what he saw as a dangerous erosion of public trust in the federal court system. He had spent sleepless nights reviewing Roumie's statements, consulting with other legal minds, and preparing what many legal observers expected to be a thorough and principled defense of judicial impartiality. Across the courtroom sat Jonathan Roumie, the 49-year-old American actor who had achieved global recognition for his portrayal of Jesus in the acclaimed series The Chosen. Roumie's public profile extended far beyond his acting, as he had become a respected voice for faith, morality, and spiritual reflection in public discourse. Though not a legal professional, his thoughtful commentary on the ethical and societal dimensions of law had resonated deeply with millions. Roumie's journey to prominence had been remarkable. Through his acting, he cultivated a reputation for sincerity and a deep engagement with profound themes. He often spoke about the importance of foundational values, the pursuit of truth, and the need for institutions to serve the common good with integrity. While many public figures addressed legal issues from a political or policy standpoint, Roumie approached them from a philosophical and moral perspective, often reflecting on the spirit of justice and the role of conscience in public life. When he spoke, it was not as a lawmaker or an activist, but as a public figure uniquely positioned to articulate a vision of societal well-being rooted in timeless principles. Over the past month, Roumie had been making headlines with his commentary on the federal judiciary, not by critiquing specific rulings, but by questioning what he perceived as a drift from core constitutional and moral principles in the application of law. He had argued that when the judiciary appears disconnected from the foundational values that uphold societal trust, public figures have a responsibility to raise questions about its trajectory. His comments had gone viral on social media, with millions of Americans sharing his videos and supporting his thoughtful observations. His most widely cited statement had come during a recent podcast interview where he had said, "The American people deserve to know that their federal judges are making decisions based on enduring constitutional principles and a commitment to justice, not fleeting cultural pressures." When we see patterns that seem to abandon these foundations, public figures have not just the right, but the moral obligation to ask tough questions. The statement had been viewed millions of times online, with supporters praising his courage to speak truth to power, while critics accused him of dangerously undermining public confidence in judicial independence. Legal scholars were divided, with some arguing that he was raising legitimate philosophical concerns about the judiciary's role, while others insisted that his comments, given his immense platform, inadvertently risked eroding institutional trust. This wasn't just about a revered legal mind and a prominent public voice engaging. This was about the fundamental balance of trust in American democracy. The federal judiciary had always been considered independent from direct political influence, a sacred principle dating back to the founding of the country. But in an era of increasing polarization and cultural shifts, that independence was being questioned like never before. Recent statistical analyses had shown clear patterns of partisan voting in federal appeals courts, with judges appointed by Republican presidents often ruling differently than those appointed by Democratic presidents on key issues. At the same time, public confidence in the federal judiciary had reached historic lows. Polling data showed that only 25% of Americans had confidence in federal courts, with many citizens expressing belief that judges made decisions based on political considerations rather than legal merit. If Judge Garland backed down from confronting Roumie, it could signal that federal judges were afraid of public questioning. If Roumie retreated from his position, it might suggest that public figures had no right to question the judiciary's adherence to foundational principles. The outcome of this confrontation would send ripples through every branch of government. Legal experts were calling it a constitutional crisis in the making. Advocates for moral accountability saw it as a test of whether public figures could engage powerful institutions. Conservative legal scholars viewed it as a defense of judicial independence. The media recognized it as must-see television. Constitutional law professors across the country had canceled classes to watch the hearing live, understanding that their students were about to witness a real-time civics lesson about institutional integrity and public accountability. Political science textbooks would likely include this moment as an example of institutional tension in American democracy. Every person in that courtroom understood they were witnessing history. The question was, who would blink first? Judge Garland called the hearing to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. The courtroom fell silent as he surveyed the packed gallery, his eyes eventually settling on Mr. Roumie. Without any preliminary remarks, he launched directly into his concerns. Mr. Roumie, the judge began, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. I want to address some statements you've made recently regarding the federal judiciary and its foundational principles. Statements that I find deeply troubling. The courtroom tension was instant. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras zoomed in on both men and spectators held their breath. This was happening faster than anyone expected. Roumie remained perfectly still, his expression neutral, hands still folded calmly on the table in front of him. He had clearly prepared for this moment. Your Honor, Mr. Roumie responded evenly. I'm here to address any concerns you may have. Judge Garland wasn't satisfied with pleasantries. He pulled out a folder thick with printed materials. Clearly, he had done his homework. Last Tuesday, you stated on national television that federal judges appear to be drifting from enduring constitutional principles in favor of transient cultural currents. On Friday, you suggested that the legal system as a whole seems to have lost its moral compass. Yesterday, you called the federal court system broken beyond repair in its ability to inspire public trust. The judge's voice grew stronger with each accusation, and murmurs began rippling through the gallery. Security officers positioned themselves more alertly, sensing the rising tension. These statements, Judge Garland continued, represent a dangerous attack on the independence and perceived impartiality of the federal judiciary. They undermine public confidence in our legal system and suggest that you believe judges should rule based on what is culturally convenient rather than the enduring principles of law. Roumie listened without interruption, occasionally nodding slightly to show he was following along. His calm demeanor was remarkable given the intensity of the accusations being leveled against him. The judge's preparation was evident in every word he spoke. He had clearly spent hours reviewing transcripts, watching video clips, and analyzing Roumie's statements for patterns and themes his legal training showed as he methodically built his case against the actor's recent comments. Furthermore, Judge Garland continued, pulling out additional documents from his folder, your statements, while perhaps intended to be philosophical, have been amplified by social media accounts that regularly attack federal judges by name. Your words have been used by some to justify threats against federal court personnel. Do you understand the real-world consequences of your rhetoric, especially given your significant public platform? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Roumie's supporters in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, while legal observers nodded in agreement with the judge's concerns. Judge Garland wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Roumie's face. Furthermore, Mr. Roumie, your comments suggest a fundamental misunderstanding of the judiciary's essential role. Federal judges are appointed for life precisely so they can make difficult decisions without fear of political or popular retaliation. When you suggest otherwise, you're attacking one of the foundational principles of American democracy, an independent judiciary. Roumie's supporters in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. They had come to support Roumie, but the judge's words carried undeniable authority. Conservative legal observers nodded in agreement, sensing validation of their concerns about public overreach. Roumie finally spoke, his voice steady and clear. Your Honor, may I respond to these concerns? You may, Judge Garland replied curtly, but I want you to understand the gravity of this situation. Your words have consequences, Mr. Roumie. They influence public opinion and can damage institutions that have served this country for over 2 centuries. The judge's tone had grown more serious with each exchange. What had started as a formal judicial proceeding was becoming something more personal, more intense. The packed courtroom could sense that this was building toward a climactic moment. Judge Garland pulled out what appeared to be a thick compilation of public remarks from his folder. I have here a compilation of social media posts, news articles, and public statements that directly quote your comments about federal judges. Some of these posts include personal information about judges and their families. Others contain explicit threats of violence. He held up the document so the courtroom could see its thickness. This is what happens when public figures make irresponsible statements about the judiciary. You may not have intended these consequences, but you cannot escape responsibility for them. The accusation was devastating. Roumie's supporters in the gallery looked stunned, while his critics appeared vindicated. The suggestion that his words had contributed to threats against judges and their families was the most serious charge yet leveled against him. The judge continued his pointed questioning, and the atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly charged. Legal experts in the gallery were frantically taking notes, understanding they were witnessing a historic confrontation between a judicial authority and a prominent public voice. Do you believe, Mr. Roumie, that federal judges should make decisions based on what's popular with the public or what aligns with current cultural trends? Judge Garland asked, his tone suggesting he already knew that he wouldn't like the answer. Or perhaps you think judges should rule based on what public figures or movements prefer, even if it deviates from strict legal interpretation? He continued, because that seems to be what your recent statements suggest. The questions came rapid fire now, each one designed to corner Roumie into admitting either that he had overstepped his bounds or that he fundamentally misunderstood the role of the judiciary. But Roumie remained unflappable. He listened to each question, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad, but never appearing flustered or defensive. His poise was showing. He knew how to handle hostile questioning. The tension in the courtroom was becoming palpable. Reporters were typing furiously, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would dominate headlines for days. Roumie's supporters, who had come to support him, looked increasingly worried, while legal scholars appeared to be enjoying the spectacle of a public figure being held accountable. Judge Garland's voice rose slightly as he delivered what seemed designed to be the knockout blow. Mr. Roumie, I'm going to be very direct with you. Your recent statements, while perhaps well-intentioned, border on undermining the fundamental trust in the federal court system. They suggest that you believe popular sentiment or a particular moral framework should override established legal process and judicial decisions. This is antithetical to everything our legal system stands for. The courtroom was dead silent. Every person present understood they were witnessing the climax of this confrontation. The judge had laid down his challenge in the strongest possible terms. I want you to think very carefully about your next words, Judge Garland continued, because they will be heard not just by the people in this courtroom, but by judges, lawyers, and citizens across the country. How do you justify statements that are perceived as attacks on judicial independence and the rule of law? This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The judge had delivered his warning with maximum force and authority. Now it was Roumie's turn to respond, and his answer would determine whether this confrontation escalated further or found some resolution. The cameras captured every micro-expression as Jonathan Roumie slowly stood up, adjusted his suit, and prepared to deliver his response to one of the most powerful legal figures in America. The silence in the courtroom was so complete that the whirring of the television cameras seemed unusually loud. Jonathan Roumie rose from his seat with deliberate composure, his movements measured and confident. The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward in anticipation. Judge Garland sat back slightly, clearly expecting either a confrontation or an apology. What happened next would become the most watched courtroom moment in recent public discourse history. Your Honor, Roumie began, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom with crystal clarity. I appreciate your concerns and I respect the institution you represent, but I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about my statements and my intentions. Judge Garland's eyebrows raised slightly, but he remained silent, waiting to see where this was heading. Roumie pulled out his own folder. He had clearly come prepared for this exact confrontation. Your Honor, with respect, I believe my statements have been taken out of context. When I spoke about the judiciary's adherence to foundational principles, I was referring to the documented erosion of public trust and the clear perception of ideological divides that have emerged in recent years. This isn't an attack on judicial independence. It's an acknowledgement of a societal reality that thoughtful observers across the spectrum have noted. He opened his folder and pulled out the first document. According to research from reputable institutions, public perception of the federal judiciary increasingly views it through an ideological lens, with decisions often seen as aligning with the political leanings of the appointing president. When I speak about this, I'm not attacking the judiciary. I'm calling for a renewed commitment to transparency and adherence to constitutional principles in a system that claims to be above political influence, but increasingly struggles with that perception. The courtroom stirred. This wasn't the defensive response anyone expected. Roumie was going on offense with facts and research. Roumie continued, his voice gaining strength and confidence with each word. Your Honor, I've spent my career observing, reflecting, and portraying profound human experiences, including those concerning justice and moral truth. I've seen how judicial decisions affect real people's lives and the moral fabric of society. When I voice concerns about the perceived trajectory of federal court decisions, I'm not attacking individual judges or the institution itself. I'm advocating for the millions of Americans who depend on our courts to uphold a consistent and principled standard of justice. He pulled out another document, this one appearing to be a statistical analysis. This study from the Pew Research Center shows that public confidence in federal courts has declined by over 40% over the past decade. This erosion of trust isn't happening because public figures are asking questions. It's happening because ordinary Americans see a system that seems increasingly disconnected from fundamental values and the common good. Judge Garland shifted in his chair, clearly not expecting such a prepared and substantive response. But Roumie wasn't finished. Furthermore, Your Honor, when I discussed accountability for the judiciary, I was referring to the inherent constitutional principles that demand all branches of government remain accountable to the people and to their foundational mandates. Article 3 of the Constitution establishes the judiciary, but its legitimacy ultimately rests on public trust and its adherence to the Constitution's spirit. This isn't a radical position, it's a call to reaffirm the very foundation of our republic. He pulled out another document, this one appearing to be from a legal textbook. Chief Justice John Marshall himself acknowledged in Marbury versus Madison that while the judiciary interprets the law, it's not above accountability to fundamental constitutional principles and to the people it serves. Diaros. When I suggest that public discourse should engage with judicial decisions, I'm advocating for the robust engagement that ensures all institutions remain true to their foundational purpose. Roumie's supporters in the gallery began to sit up straighter. Their advocate wasn't backing down. He was making his case with profound clarity. Roumie then addressed the most serious charge that had been leveled against him. Your Honor, you mentioned that my statements have been associated with threats against federal judges and their enamorados and their families. I want to be absolutely clear about this. I categorically condemn any threats of violence against judges, court personnel, or their families. Such behavior is unacceptable and has no place in our democracy. His voice took on a more personal tone but remained respectfully firm. However, I cannot accept responsibility for how others might misinterpret or misuse my words. Every public figure with a platform faces the same challenge. We speak about important issues knowing that some individuals might take our words in directions we never intended. The solution cannot be to stop discussing important constitutional questions. But Roumie's most powerful moment was yet to come. He looked directly at Judge Garland, his voice remaining respectfully firm. Your Honor, I want to address your concern about undermining public confidence in the judicial system. With respect, public confidence in the federal judiciary is already at historic lows. According to recent polling, only 25% of Americans have confidence in the federal courts, the lowest level ever recorded. He paused, letting that statistic sink in. This loss of confidence isn't because public figures are asking tough questions. It's because ordinary Americans see a system that seems increasingly disconnected from their daily lives and struggles, and from the bedrock principles we all profess to uphold. When federal judges make decisions that affect millions of people, those people have a right to understand the reasoning, and their public representatives have a right to ask questions. Judge Garland's expression had changed. The confident authority he had displayed earlier was now mixed with something else, perhaps recognition that Roumie had a point. Roumie stepped slightly closer to the bench, his voice taking on a more personal tone while remaining respectful. Your Honor, I didn't become an actor, and I didn't choose to engage in public discourse to attack our institutions. I did it to help remind us of the principles they're supposed to serve. When I see federal court decisions that seem to depart from foundational constitutional values, or appear to ignore the real-world impact on the moral fabric of our society, I don't think the appropriate response is silence. He gestured toward the packed gallery. These people, the American people, they deserve to have their voices heard, even when that advocacy means asking uncomfortable questions about powerful institutions. Then Roumie did something that caught everyone off guard. Instead of continuing his defense, he pivoted to a question for the judge. Your Honor, may I ask you something? Do you believe that the federal judiciary is perfect? Do you believe that no federal judge has ever made a decision influenced by personal philosophy or societal pressure? Do you believe that the system is working as well as it possibly could for all Americans and for the enduring principles of justice? The courtroom was stunned. No one challenges a federal judge with direct questions during a hearing. But Roumie had done it so respectfully, so thoughtfully, that even Judge Garland seemed taken aback. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Judge Garland sat quietly, clearly processing what he had just heard. The angry authority from earlier had given way to something more thoughtful, more nuanced. "Mr. Roumie," he finally said, his voice notably softer than before, "you make some valid points about constitutional responsibilities and the current state of public confidence in the judiciary." The admission sent a ripple through the courtroom. The judge was actually engaging with Roumie's arguments rather than simply dismissing them. "However," Judge Garland continued, "I still believe that the way concerns are raised matters tremendously. The language used, the form chosen, the tone taken. All of these things affect how the message is received and whether it helps or hurts the cause of justice." Roumie nodded thoughtfully. "Your Honor, I absolutely agree with that point. If my language has been interpreted as disrespectful to the institution of the judiciary, that was not my intention, and I'm willing to be more careful about how I express these concerns going forward." The courtroom buzz grew louder. This was not the confrontation anyone had expected. Instead of a battle, they were witnessing two intelligent, principled men finding common ground on a complex issue. But the moment that would break the internet came next. Judge Garland leaned forward slightly and said, "Mr. Roumie, I want to thank you for your thoughtful response today. You've reminded me that even federal judges need to listen carefully to criticism and consider whether changes might be needed in how we operate." Then he added the line that would be shared millions of times. "Perhaps we both serve the cause of justice better and we challenge each other respectfully rather than simply defending our positions." The courtroom erupted in surprised applause. Even the bailiff seemed caught off guard by the sudden shift from confrontation to mutual respect. Roumie smiled genuinely for the first time during the hearing. "Thank you, Your Honor. I believe that respectful dialogue between our institutions and the public is exactly what the American people deserve." Within minutes of the hearing's conclusion, clips of Jonathan Roumie's response were spreading across social media like wildfire. The hashtag Roumie response began trending nationally before the participants had even left the courthouse. The most shared clip showed the moment when Roumie asked Judge Garland whether the judiciary was perfect, followed by the judge's surprisingly thoughtful response. Users across the political spectrum were sharing the video with captions like, "This is how public disagreements should be handled," and "Respectful but firm, exactly what we need more of." Advocates for moral accountability were celebrating Roumie's performance as a masterclass in standing firm while remaining respectful. Legal observers across the spectrum, surprisingly, were also praising his approach, noting that he had raised legitimate philosophical and constitutional questions without resorting to personal attacks or inflammatory rhetoric. One viral tweet read, "Jonathan Roumie just showed everyone how to engage authority respectfully without losing your dignity or your argument. This is leadership." The tweet was shared over 50,000 times within 2 hours. The video clips were being dissected frame by frame on political talk shows and social media platforms. Communication experts pointed out specific moments where Roumie's body language, tone, and word choice had shifted the dynamic from confrontational to collaborative. Political science professors and communication experts were already incorporating the exchange into their curricula as an example of effective public communication and civil discourse. Legal commentators were having a field day analyzing what had just occurred. Constitutional law professors noted that Roumie had demonstrated a profound understanding of the moral and philosophical underpinnings of the Constitution while making his case for judicial integrity and public trust. Political analysts pointed out that his calm, prepared response had likely enhanced his national profile significantly. Instead of being seen as a public figure making reckless or uninformed attacks on the judiciary, he was now being viewed as a thoughtful advocate capable of engaging with complex institutional questions through a lens of principle. Even typically critical conservative media outlets were grudgingly admitting that Roumie had handled himself well. One prominent legal blogger wrote, "While one might disagree with the specific emphasis of Mr. Roumie's comments, his performance today showed exactly the kind of respectful but principled engagement our public discourse needs more of." Perhaps most surprisingly, Judge Garland's post-hearing comments to reporters were remarkably positive. Mr. Roumie demonstrated today that it's possible to raise serious questions about judicial operations and principles while maintaining respect for the institution, he said. "That's the kind of dialogue that strengthens our democracy rather than weakening it." Legal experts noted that federal judges rarely make such positive public comments about individuals who have criticized the courts. The judge's response was being seen as an acknowledgement that Roumie had found the right tone for raising difficult questions. The hearing's outcome had immediate public implications. Advocates for public accountability and principled engagement, who had been worried about overly confrontational tactics, now had an example of how to be firm without being destructive. Roumie's approach was being studied as a model for future interactions between public figures and institutional authorities. Thoughtful citizens across the political spectrum, who had been concerned about the increasing vitriol in public discourse, were pointing to Roumie's performance as evidence that it's possible to address systemic concerns without resorting to attacks on democratic institutions themselves. Even some critics privately admitted that Roumie had raised valid points about judicial adherence to foundational principles and public trust, though they were unlikely to say so publicly. Political scientists began analyzing the hearing as a potential turning point in how public confrontations are conducted. The fact that both men had found common ground while maintaining their principles was being held up as a model for public engagement in an era of extreme polarization. Communication experts noted that Roumie's success came from three key factors: thorough preparation, respectful tone, and willingness to acknowledge valid points from the other side. These elements, they argued, could be applied to public disagreements across the spectrum. The hearing had clearly elevated Jonathan Roumie's national profile significantly. Public commentators were already speculating about his potential for broader influence, noting that his performance had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership qualities that many citizens say they want to see more of. His social media engagement saw an unprecedented surge, and numerous organizations promoting civil discourse reached out about potential speaking engagements and collaboration opportunities. The hearing had essentially served as a national demonstration of principled public engagement. Perhaps most importantly, the hearing had started conversations about actual reforms to improve judicial transparency and accountability. Legal experts were discussing specific changes that could address some of the concerns Roumie had raised about public trust and adherence to foundational principles while preserving judicial independence. Some federal courts announced they would begin publishing more detailed explanations of their decision-making processes. Others indicated they would expand public access to court proceedings and documents. The National Association of Federal Judges issued a statement saying they would be reviewing current practices to ensure they were maintaining appropriate transparency while preserving independence. As political commentators analyzed the day's events, a clear theme emerged. Confrontation doesn't have to mean destruction. Roumie had proven that it's possible to engage powerful institutions while actually strengthening public discourse. The hearing was being studied in political science classes as an example of effective public communication. The key elements, preparation, respect, principled firmness, and willingness to find common ground, were being held up as a model for public engagement. The success of Roumie's approach raised questions about whether other public figures would adopt similar strategies. Early indicators suggested that several prominent individuals from various fields were studying his performance and considering how to apply similar approaches to their own institutional challenges. What had started as a potential constitutional crisis had instead become a model for democratic engagement. Judge Garland's warning had been met with Roumie's calm, prepared response, and both men had emerged with enhanced reputations. The American people had witnessed two strong leaders disagree respectfully and find common ground without compromising their principles. In an era of extreme political polarization, that alone was remarkable. The story of Judge Garland's warning and Jonathan Roumie's response became more than just a viral moment. It became a template for how democratic institutions and public figures can challenge each other constructively rather than destructively. As the dust settled on this remarkable public moment, one thing was clear. Jonathan Roumie had not just defended his position or avoided a confrontation. He had set a new standard for how public figures can engage with institutional authority firmly, but respectfully, substantively, but constructively. His calm response to Judge Garland's warning had gone viral, not just because it was dramatic, but because it represented something Americans rarely see anymore: principled public leadership that brings out the best in our democratic institutions rather than tearing them down. The question now was whether other public leaders would follow his example, or whether this would remain a rare moment of public excellence in an otherwise polarized era. If you found this incredible story as compelling as millions of other Americans did, make sure to like this video and subscribe to stay updated on all the public discourse moments that are reshaping our democracy. Which public figure do you think should follow Jonathan Roumie's example of respectful but firm engagement? Let us know in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next story where we explore who might be the next public figure to master this approach to democratic leadership.